Did you know that without renter's insurance, even a simple accident in your rental property could really cost you thousands? And we want to make sure that that never happens to you. So today we're diving into a super important topic, in my opinion, that can save you a lot of stress and a lot of money, and that is renter's insurance. So in today's video, I'm going to be covering why renter's insurance is an absolute must and how it protects you and your tenant, and tips for making sure too that your tenant's policy actually stays active through the tenancy. In the lease that we use in my company, it's a requirement that all tenants have renter's insurance and that they must have proof of it prior to their move-in. And we take it an extra step further and we monitor this throughout their lease term so that they can't just cancel it and then it lapses and then they don't have the coverage. Now, I certainly hope that you are doing this as well. So let's first talk about what renter's insurance is, okay? It is generally coverage for your tenants for their belongings, their personal belongings really, and their liability. So let's talk about the personal belongings first. So this part of renter's insurance, it protects the tenant's possessions from things that would cause damage to it. These are things called perils. These usually include things like fire or smoke damage, things like theft, water damage, vandalism even, and other kinds of acts of nature that can cause damage. The renter's insurance helps the tenant replace damaged or lost items if something were to happen. And it's a very common misconception among tenants that they think that your homeowner insurance covers them, but really it doesn't. It doesn't cover them, their belongings, their liability. They need their own renter's insurance policy to protect their stuff. You want to make sure that they really do understand this, and that way you're not responsible for anything related to their belongings, and their renter's insurance policy adds that extra layer of protection for you and your property as well. So this brings me to point number 2, which is really the liability coverage. And this is where the renter's insurance, well, it really becomes a game changer for both the tenants and the landlords. So liability coverage steps in when a tenant is responsible for, say, accidental damage or injuries. So let's look at a couple of examples. The first would be damages to your property. So let's say that the tenant accidentally started a fire or caused some sort of water damage, like leaving a tub running, overflows downstairs, and you've got water everywhere. Their liability coverage can help cover the cost of that repair into your property. So we had a situation like this where there were 4 individuals, they were unrelated, and something happened in the home. I can't even remember what caused it exactly. It was like an extension cord or something like that that was faulty. That caught on fire, the house caught on fire, and it was a really kind of a big deal. One of those tenants had renter's insurance and the other 3 did not. So guess what? That tenant, their insurance put them in a hotel. It helped replace their belongings that were damaged. The other 2 tenants, they didn't get anything. And I think they moved it back in with their parents for the time being. And down the road, we had an insurance company call us who wanted to go after the other 2 tenants. So they didn't have any sort of protection. And that's a really good story for why you want to have renter's insurance. Okay, so another example of this is injuries to other people. So let's say someone is injured in your rental property, like say guest trips on a rug or they get seriously injured, or maybe there's a loose walkway and they trip and they really get hurt. The liability coverage can cover medical bills and other legal fees. So if the injured person decides to sue, and we all know that these days people will literally sue for just about anything. And I know that's honestly really sad, but it is a reality. So another example is, let's say there's damage to another person's property. You have a tenant, they have a kid, they have some friends over, they're playing baseball, they hit a ball through your neighbor's window. Well, then their liability insurance can help cover these costs of repairing that window as well. If you have a tenant who has a dog and they bite someone in the rental property, their liability insurance can also help cover that victim's medical bills or legal expenses or whatnot. Now, another bonus coverage is something called additional living expenses, ALE. So many renters insurance policies have this additional clause, and that covers temporary living expenses if the unit becomes, let's say, uninhabitable to damage. Like I talked about earlier in that fire example, one of the tenants, their insurance covered them staying in a hotel. So that's what this kind of extra coverage involves. It involves things like hotel stays. It can involve things like meals at restaurants and various other expenses while your tenant waits for the property to be repaired so they can move back in. So now, how does this actually help you? So if your tenant has additional living expense coverage, then they're going to be less likely to demand from you, for example, for you to pay for that hotel room. They're going to say, hey, I didn't cause this fire, or maybe they did cause it, or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. They're still going to come after you to pay for some of these things, but if their insurance has this clause, then they're not going to really look to you because they're going to have it anyway. Okay, so let's look at some other real world examples. And so let's say you have a tenant who accidentally starts a kitchen fire. It costs maybe $15,000 of damage. We've seen this before. And now the tenant has renter's insurance, and their liability coverage can kick in and reimburse you for the cost of those repairs. Without it, you might be chasing down that tenant for payment, or really you might end up paying for it out of pocket yourself, which you obviously don't want to do. Another example might be a burst pipe. That's actually pretty common. And right now where I am in Washington, D.C. in January, it's pretty darn cold. Maybe it's been around 5 or 10 degrees. Burst pipes happen more frequently than you think. And this is a tenant responsibility. But if this happens, it's going to cause damage. And they may come and blame you, even though it's not your responsibility. So their renter's insurance, it will cover and help put things back together. Bottom line here really is that renter's insurance prevents all these kinds of scenarios from really becoming your headache. So now let's just look at some of the benefits of your tenant having renter's insurance. The benefits for you as the landlord. First of all, it's going to minimize conflict. Like I just said, you don't want your tenant coming after you and asking you to pay for X, Y, and Z because now they don't have somewhere to live because of something that they did. Like I said, if they got displaced and they wanted you to pay for it, when they have renter's insurance, it's very clear who's responsible for what. And so that reduces a lot of stress, creates a lot less drama and confrontation if something were to happen. Second thing is, it protects your investment, like we were just talked about as well. And their renter's insurance helps cover liability claims that might affect you indirectly. It also attracts responsible tenants. Sometimes you may get a tenant who doesn't really want to get renter's insurance. Well, do you really want that tenant? And it shows your tenants when you require this that you're really running a professional operation and you're running a real business, not just doing this as a hobby. Okay, so there are a few things that aren't typically covered by renter's insurance. And these would be things like flood and earthquakes. These are things that generally require their own separate policies. Also, roommate belongings. One roommate's policy is not going to cover the property of another roommate, like we just talked about in the example I gave you. So that's something else that would generally not be covered. And it doesn't cover normal wear and tear or intentional damage. Let's talk about how you can require renter's insurance from your tenant and make sure that they actually keep it in place during their tenancy. One thing we found was happening way back when would be tenants would say yes, that they had renter's insurance and they'd show us their policy, but guess what? Within a few months, they just decided they didn't want to pay for it anymore and they canceled it. And then we didn't have any idea that it was canceled. But we've now put more checks and balances into our process so we can monitor when something does get canceled and make sure that that policy stays into effect through the lease term. First of all, you want to make sure that it is a requirement in your lease and that it's included as a mandatory clause in the lease agreement. No questions asked. And you want to specify that they show you that there are limits of the term, they show you proof of insurance, and you want to check for compliance. So you want to basically get the proof that they actually have the policy. And like I said, you want to make sure that you set reminders to verify annually or even mid-lease that policy still is in place. One thing I'd suggest is that you ask to be an additional interested party on their policy, and that way you get notified if there's any lapse in the policy. And that should be at no extra cost to your tenant to add you like this. What if your tenant does complain and they don't want to get the insurance? Well, like I just said a second ago, you know what? If they're going to be that kind of tenant, I would just tell you, move on. If this only costs about $10 or $20 a month, and if your tenant can't do that and they don't want to have that coverage and protect themselves, protect your property, I would say move on. Don't get them as a tenant. You don't need a tenant like that. There are plenty of other good people out there who will take care of your property and do the right thing. If they don't want to do this and abide by this term in your lease, what makes you think they will agree and uphold other terms in your lease? I don't think so. I've seen that before. We just went over a bunch of things and a bunch of reasons why renter's insurance is super important. But to summarize, essentially, it's really a win-win for landlords and for tenants to protect their belongings, their liability, and to ensure that your property stays safe. And if you're not requiring renter's insurance yet, I highly encourage you to start doing it now. And if you have any tips or any stories in your experience with renter's insurance or having your tenants have them or not, share them in the comments. We'd like to know what's happening with you. And before you go, now that we've talked a little bit about renter's insurance, check out this video and make sure that you as a landlord have the right coverage to protect you. So take care, subscribe to my channel, share this with others, and I'll see you next time.